In the bustling city of New York, in the year 1871, a building stood that was meant to be a sanctuary of care and healing. To the public, it was another proud addition to the growing network of mental health institutions sweeping across America. The promise was noble: the mentally ill, the vulnerable, and the forgotten would be given shelter, treatment, and dignity. But behind its stone walls and heavy iron gates, a different reality festered. This was not a place of safety, but of silence, shadows, and whispers. It was a ward that patients swore had a mind of its own, a ward that did not just confine people, it hunted them. The 19th century was a time of extraordinary contradictions. On the surface, it was an age of optimism. Advances in science and medicine promised breakthroughs in understanding the human body and the human mind. Reformers rallied for more humane treatment of those who had been cast aside by society. Yet, beneath that hopeful facade was a darker undercurrent. The mental health system, often run by underfunded state institutions and politically motivated city officials, became a place where ideals were twisted into nightmares. It is in this paradoxical environment that our story begins. The city was expanding rapidly, its population exploding with immigrants, veterans returning from a civil war, and the poor struggling to survive. The institutions that promised to help them quickly became overcrowded, and what was once envisioned as a beacon of progress morphed into a labyrinth of despair. The asylum ward we are about to explore was not just another facility, it became infamous for the terror it inspired. For those who entered, the building itself seemed alive, its hallways stretching like veins, its rooms swallowing the cries of the desperate. What makes this story so unsettling is not only the cruelty inflicted by human hands, but the way the patients themselves described their experiences. They spoke of being followed, not by orderlies, but by something intangible. They reported that they were stalked in the night, not by fellow inmates, but by the ward itself. Some said they could hear the walls breathing. Others claimed that when they tried to sleep, unseen eyes watched them from the shadows. These testimonies blur the line between reality and horror, leaving us to question, was this simply the paranoia of troubled minds, or was there truly something monstrous in the ward? History has a way of burying uncomfortable truths. Records from the period are incomplete, often destroyed to protect reputations or simply lost in the chaos of time. Yet, fragments remain, patient letters smuggled out, journalist accounts that were dismissed as sensationalism, whispers preserved in folklore. They tell us of a place where people vanished without explanation, where the boundary between treatment and torture was thin, and where the very architecture seemed complicit in cruelty. As we uncover this forgotten asylum horror, it's important to understand that this was not an isolated case. Across America and Europe, asylums became both symbols of progress and warehouses of suffering. But in 1871 New York, this particular ward stood out. It had a reputation so dark that even among other institutions, it was whispered about with unease. The patients were not just confined there, they were prey. Why does this matter today? Because history has a disturbing way of repeating itself. When we look back at the suffering endured by those locked behind the asylum doors, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how society treats its most vulnerable. The cruelty of the past is not as distant as we would like to believe. Even now, underfunded hospitals, neglected care homes, and hidden institutions remind us that human suffering is often easiest to ignore when it is locked away. This introduction is only the doorway into a much darker labyrinth. Over the course of this story, we will peel back the layers of history to examine how the ward was created, what life was like for those trapped inside, and how it earned its chilling reputation as a place that hunted its own patients. We will meet the doctors who believed they were pioneers but acted as tormentors, the staff who blurred the line between duty and cruelty, and the patients who dared to speak out even as their voices were silenced. By the end, we will confront the central mystery. Was this ward merely a tragic byproduct of a flawed system, or was there truly something predatory within its walls, something that made it more than just a hospital, more than just a prison? A place that seemed to feed on fear, despair, and silence. This is the story of a forgotten asylum horror, hidden within the shadows of 19th century New York. This is the story of the ward that should never have existed. To understand how a ward like the one in New York could ever exist, we need to step back into the wider history of the 19th century. This was an era obsessed with progress, order, and the promise of science to solve every human problem. But it was also an age where cruelty was often disguised as care. The rise of asylums across America reflected both of these contradictions. The asylum movement began with good intentions. Reformers like Dorothea Dix campaigned tirelessly in the mid-1800s, arguing that the mentally ill should not be chained in basements, abandoned in almshouses, or left to rot in prisons. They deserved specialized institutions where they could receive moral treatment. This philosophy claimed that a calm environment, order, and gentle encouragement could restore sanity. Across the United States, states and cities poured money into grand asylum projects, often designed with sweeping wings and beautiful gardens. To the public eye, these places were monuments of compassion. But there was a darker side to this movement. The very size of these new facilities made them impersonal. Designed to hold hundreds, and eventually thousands, they soon became overcrowded. Instead of havens of healing, they turned into warehouses of the unwanted, housing not only the mentally ill but also epileptics, alcoholics, prostitutes, the homeless, and sometimes even political dissidents. Anyone society did not want to deal with could be locked away in the name of treatment. New York was at the center of this boom. After the Civil War, the city was bursting with immigrants pouring in from Europe. Irish, Italian, and German families crowded into tenements with poor sanitation, rampant disease, and crushing poverty. Public officials worried about crime, disorder, and unrest. Building asylums became both a solution and a weapon. On the surface, it was about charity and progress. Beneath the surface, it was about control, removing those who did not fit into the city's vision of respectability. Behind the funding of these institutions lurked Tammany Hall, New York's notorious political machine. Corrupt politicians saw asylums as opportunities for contracts, jobs, and patronage. Money poured into construction and staffing, but very little made its way to patient care. Conditions deteriorated quickly. The city could boast about its modern institutions, while hiding the fact that inside, patients were neglected, abused, and forgotten. The architecture of these asylums reflected their double purpose. Many were built according to the Kirkbride plan, an architectural style designed by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride. These massive buildings had long wings extending from a central hub, meant to separate patients by illness and allow sunlight and fresh air into every room. The design was supposed to heal. But in practice, the endless corridors and locked wards created a labyrinth. Patients often spoke of becoming disoriented, unable to find their way back, as though the building itself wanted them lost. What was intended as order felt instead like a trap. Medical science of the period also fed into the creation of these wards. Psychiatry was in its infancy, and many doctors were eager to experiment. Without modern understanding of mental illness, treatments ranged from the misguided to the outright cruel. Cold baths, bloodletting, isolation chambers, and early forms of electrotherapy were seen as legitimate methods. Patients were often restrained for hours or days at a time. Reformers claimed this was more humane than chains, but for the patients, it was still imprisonment. By the 1870s, the cracks in the system were already showing. Reports emerged of overcrowding, disease outbreaks, and abusive staff. Yet, society clung to the idea that asylums were necessary. After all, where else could the unfit go? Families often willingly sent relatives away, convinced they were doing the right thing. Once inside, however, patients discovered there was little chance of escape. Many who entered never came out again. It was within this broader context that New York's notorious ward of 1871 was born. It was not an accident or an isolated failure. It was the inevitable product of a system that valued appearances over reality, efficiency over humanity. The city wanted a place to put those deemed incurable, and so a ward was created specifically to hold them. By definition, those admitted were not expected to recover. They were meant to disappear quietly into the system, their lives written off before they had even begun. The ward became a dumping ground, a place where the most vulnerable were sent to vanish. Doctors could test unproven treatments on them, politicians could point to it as evidence of their commitment to progress, and society could rest easy knowing its troublesome elements were locked away. But for the patients, this was the beginning of a nightmare. They were trapped in an environment where care was secondary to control, and where the line between treatment and torment blurred. In the years to come, the reputation of this ward would grow darker. Patients would tell stories not only of neglect but of being hunted, stalked, and preyed upon. The conditions of 19th century asylum life made such horrors possible. With minimal oversight, corrupt officials, and medical theories that often justified cruelty, the perfect environment was created for abuse to thrive. The rise of asylums in 19th century America was painted as a humanitarian triumph. In truth, it was a system that dehumanized countless people. The very institutions meant to heal became places of horror. And in New York, in 1871, one ward would earn a reputation so terrifying that it has lingered in whispers for over a century. The year 1871 marked a turning point for New York City's mental health system. In a city swollen with immigrants, veterans, and the poor, officials decided that one of the great new asylums needed an additional wing, one that would house the incurables. This was not just an administrative decision, it was a statement. To be labeled incurable meant you were beyond hope, beyond treatment, beyond humanity in the eyes of the system. The creation of this ward was supposed to free up space for other patients, but in reality, it became a dumping ground for society's unwanted. The ward was constructed quickly, with efficiency prioritized over compassion. It was attached to one of the city's existing asylums, a sprawling structure already crowded with patients. Officials called it Progress, an isolated section where those deemed untreatable could live out their days quietly, away from the rest of the institution. The truth, however, was more chilling. The ward was designed less like a place of healing and more like a holding pen. Thick iron doors, narrow windows, and endless corridors gave it the feel of a prison. Patients would later describe the air inside as stagnant, heavy, as though the walls themselves pressed in on them. In official reports, the ward was praised as a necessary innovation. City leaders boasted that New York was taking steps to modernize its mental health system. Newspaper articles highlighted the building's impressive size and the efficiency with which it could house dozens of patients. But even from the start, there were whispers. Nurses spoke of inadequate supplies, overcrowded rooms, and the unsettling atmosphere of the place. One early visitor noted that the hall seemed to swallow sound, leaving an eerie silence punctuated only by distant cries. The patients admitted here were a mixture of the genuinely ill and the socially inconvenient. Some suffered from severe mental illness, schizophrenia, mania, dementia. Others, however, had been placed here for reasons that had little to do with medicine. Poor immigrants who could not support themselves, women deemed hysterical, epileptics, alcoholics, and even men with political enemies found themselves behind the ward's iron gates. Once labeled incurable, there was almost no chance of leaving. The staff assigned to the ward were often the least experienced or the most jaded. Many saw it as punishment to be stationed there, a career dead end within the asylum system. Underpaid and overwhelmed, they grew indifferent to the suffering around them. With minimal oversight, discipline often came in the form of violence. Reports of beatings, forced feedings, and prolonged restraints began to circulate, but few outside the walls listened. After all, who would take the word of the insane over that of respectable doctors and administrators? It was in these early years that the ward began to acquire its unsettling reputation. Patients spoke of hearing footsteps in empty hallways, of being dragged from their rooms at night for treatments that left them bruised and broken. Some claimed that the staff moved like predators, choosing who to torment and when. Others insisted that the ward itself seemed alive, shifting and twisting as if to trap them. These accounts were dismissed as delusions, yet they spread quickly among the inmates, creating an atmosphere of constant dread. The ward's records from its opening years are sparse, but what little remains suggests that mortality rates were high. Patients frequently died of disease, neglect, or injury, yet official reports often listed vague causes such as exhaustion or natural decline. Families rarely questioned these explanations. Many had already written off their relatives as lost, or they lacked the power to challenge the institution. For the city, the deaths were a convenience, one less mouth to feed, one more bed available for the next arrival. By the mid-1870s, the ward's dark reputation had spread beyond its walls. Journalists occasionally hinted at conditions inside, though most articles were quickly buried or discredited. Reformers spoke in hushed tones of abuses, but with Tammany Hall controlling much of the city's politics, little action was taken. The ward remained open, its horrors hidden beneath a veneer of progress and civic pride. For the patients, every day became a struggle for survival. To enter the ward was to enter a place where hope was stripped away, where your future was no longer your own. Doctors treated the inmates as specimens rather than people. Orderlies enforced silence and submission. And all the while, the stories grew, of shadows moving in the dark, of cries echoing from empty rooms, of people who disappeared and were never seen again. The birth of the ward in 1871 was framed as a step forward in psychiatric care. In truth, it was the beginning of a nightmare. What was meant to be a place of containment quickly became a place of terror. Its design, its staff, Its very purpose all converged to create an environment where cruelty flourished unchecked. The city had built a monument not to progress, but to despair. And this was only the beginning. The true horror lay not in its creation, but in what life inside the ward would become. To imagine life inside the ward of 1871 is to imagine existence stripped of dignity, of choice, and of hope. Once the iron doors closed behind a new arrival, the world outside ceased to exist. The rhythms of the day, the meals, the hours of rest, even the very movement of one's body were no longer one's own. The ward dictated everything, and for those unfortunate enough to be placed there, survival meant learning how to exist under its crushing weight. Mornings began not with sunlight or a gentle wake, but with the harsh clanging of keys and the barked orders of attendants. Patients slept in narrow, hard cots, their mattresses often little more than straw sacks crawling with lice. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and disinfectant that seemed to do little more than mask the stench of disease. Overcrowding meant that many slept several to a room, or even in hallways, pressed together like unwanted cargo. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Meals were sparse and unappetizing. Breakfast might consist of thin porridge or stale bread. Dinner was often boiled potatoes or watery stew. The food was rarely enough to keep hunger at bay, and it was often served cold. Those who refused to eat were force-fed, sometimes violently, with crude devices that left patients gagging or bleeding. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them more vulnerable to illness. Yet in the eyes of the staff, feeding was not about nourishment, it was about control. The daily routine was rigid and monotonous. Patients were marched from one room to another in silence, expected to follow orders without question. Those who could still work were put to labor, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, tending the asylum's gardens. Officially, this was part of moral treatment, the idea that structured activity could restore sanity. In reality, it was free labor for the institution. For those deemed too ill or too weak to work, the day was spent sitting in bleak common rooms, staring at blank walls, the silence occasionally broken by sobbing or screams from distant corridors. Punishment was never far away. Patients who resisted, who shouted, or who disobeyed even minor instructions were restrained. Some were tied to beds with leather straps, others were locked in isolation cells, small, windowless rooms where they might be left for days in total darkness. Water was sometimes withheld as discipline, or cold baths were used to shock and subdue. Electrotherapy, still crude in its early form, was occasionally applied to patients deemed violent. The treatments left them convulsing, their minds further fractured, but the staff recorded them as medical interventions. For women, life inside the ward carried unique terrors. Many were admitted not for madness, but for disobedience. Wives who defied their husbands, daughters who refused to conform, women labeled hysterical for reasons as simple as grief or anger. Once inside, their vulnerability was exploited. Accounts whispered of nurses who ignored their cries, of doctors who used examinations as pretext for violation, of pregnancies that began and ended within the ward's walls. These women, silenced by both gender and circumstance, became some of the ward's most tragic victims. Nighttime brought its own horrors. Once the lamps were extinguished, the ward seemed to transform. The silence grew unbearable, broken only by the occasional scream, the rattling of chains, or the thud of boots echoing down the hallway. Patients spoke of lying awake, listening to footsteps approach their rooms, never knowing whether they would be left alone or dragged from their beds for treatment. The line between paranoia and reality blurred. For those trapped inside, the fear was real enough to leave them trembling in the dark. The architecture of the ward added to this sense of terror. Its corridors stretched long and featureless, every door identical, every hallway blending into the next. Patients often became disoriented, unable to tell one wing from another. Some claimed that the building shifted, that doors appeared where there had been none, that hallways seemed to extend endlessly into blackness. These descriptions sound like hallucinations, but given the constant disorientation, the oppressive atmosphere, and the sleep deprivation many endured, it is not surprising that the ward itself began to feel alive. Relationships between patients offered rare glimmers of humanity. In whispered conversations, in brief moments of shared suffering, some found companionship. They clung to one another as lifelines, trading fragments of their past lives, sharing prayers, or simply holding hands in silence. Yet even these fragile connections were threatened by the ward's rules. Speaking out of turn could invite punishment. Helping another could draw suspicion. Trust was dangerous in a place where survival often meant submission. The staff, overworked, underpaid, and sometimes cruel by nature, became part of the ward's terror. To patients, they were not protectors but predators. Some were indifferent, performing their duties mechanically, while others seemed to take pleasure in domination. Patients quickly learned which attendants to avoid, which doctors to fear, and which nurses might show fleeting kindness. But kindness was rare, and even those who meant well could do little to change the ward's systemic cruelty. What is most haunting about life inside the ward is how quickly individuality was erased. Patients lost their names, identified instead by numbers or diagnoses. Their personal histories, their loves, their losses, all stripped away. They became bodies to be managed, problems to be contained. Over time, many lost even their sense of self, retreating inward to survive. For some, madness deepened. For others, despair became the only constant companion. To outsiders, the ward remained a place of treatment, an institution dedicated to care. Reports glossed over the overcrowding, the starvation, the punishments. Families, when they visited at all, saw only what they were allowed to see. But for those who lived there, reality was far darker. The ward was not a place of healing. It was a place that consumed. Life inside these walls was a slow unraveling. Each day bled into the next, indistinguishable in its suffering. Each night brought fear of what might come. To enter was to vanish from the world, to be swallowed by a system that saw you not as a person, but as a burden. And in that vanishing, the ward itself gained its reputation, not just as a building of stone and iron, but as a predator in its own right, feeding on the lives trapped within. Behind the iron gates and endless corridors of the ward, it was not only the patients who defined the atmosphere, it was the staff. The doctors, nurses, and orderlies were the human face of the institution, the ones who carried out its daily functions. To outsiders, they were professionals, healers, caretakers, public servants. But to the patients, they often appeared as jailers, tormentors, and in some cases, monsters. Their presence was inescapable, their power absolute. Doctors held the highest authority. In theory, they were the visionaries of the asylum, guiding treatment, studying mental illness, and searching for cures. In practice, many were ambitious men eager to make names for themselves, using the ward as a laboratory. The incurables within were considered perfect subjects, patients with no expectation of release, whose suffering could be prodded, measured, and recorded without consequence. Treatments were often experiments, justified by medical jargon but rooted in cruelty. Bloodletting, long discredited but still practiced, was used to rebalance the humors. Prolonged immersion in ice baths was claimed to calm agitation, though it left patients shivering, teeth chattering, skin blistered. Some doctors pushed the boundaries further, testing electrical currents on patients' temples or attempting crude surgical procedures. The culture of medicine at the time gave them enormous leeway. Without ethical codes or oversight committees, they could frame their cruelty as science. Reports written in clinical tones described procedures as successful or inconclusive, never mentioning the screams, the injuries, or the deaths. Patients' protests were dismissed as symptoms of madness. In this way, the doctors became hunters cloaked in respectability, their prey the men and women locked within the ward. Nurses occupied an uneasy position. Many were women themselves, hired to maintain order among the patients and assist the doctors. Some came with genuine intentions of helping the vulnerable. A few tried to offer small mercies, an extra scrap of bread, a whispered word of comfort. But kindness was dangerous. Staff who showed too much sympathy risked accusations of weakness or neglecting their duties. More often, the nurses became complicit in the cruelty, restraining patients, ignoring cries for help, and enforcing silence. Among them were those who relished their authority. Stories circulate of nurses who taunted the inmates, mocking their fears and laughing at their pain. Some used physical punishment as casually as one might scold a child, slapping, pinching, or striking patients who resisted. In the night, when supervision was thinnest, darker abuses took place. Patients whispered of assaults, of being dragged into side rooms and emerging bruised, bleeding, or broken. For the victims, there was no recourse. To accuse a nurse was to be labeled delusional, a further sign of insanity. The orderlies were the blunt instruments of the ward, the ones whose boots echoed in the hallways. Usually untrained and poorly paid, they were hired for strength rather than compassion. Their job was to keep order, restrain patients, and ensure obedience. Many were violent by nature, using their fists or clubs to subdue those who resisted. To them, Patients were not people but problems to be solved quickly, forcefully, and without question. Some orderlies developed reputations that lingered long after they were gone. Patients gave them nicknames, whispered warnings to newcomers about which men to avoid. One was said to patrol the corridors like a predator, waiting for excuses to mete out punishment. Another was rumored to enjoy the process of restraint, binding patients so tightly that the straps cut into their flesh. These figures blurred the line between staff and sadist, their presence transforming the ward into a hunting ground where the hunters wore uniforms. Corruption also played its part. With Tammany Hall's grip on city politics, positions in the asylum were often handed out as favors. Loyalty to the machine mattered more than skill or compassion. This meant the ward was staffed not by the best, but by those connected to power, men and women who saw the job as a paycheck rather than a calling. Oversight was minimal, complaints were ignored, and abuses flourished in the shadows. There were exceptions, of course, doctors who believed in reform, nurses who tried to protect their charges, attendants who performed their duties without cruelty. But even the well-intentioned were trapped within the system. They faced overwhelming numbers of patients, inadequate supplies, and constant pressure to maintain order. Compassion could not overcome the machinery of neglect. In time, many became hardened, their initial empathy eroded by exhaustion and despair. For the patients, the staff became the embodiment of the ward's cruelty. The white coats of the doctors, the stiff uniforms of the nurses, the heavy boots of the orderlies, all were symbols of domination. Trust was impossible. A smile might precede a slap, a kind word might mask a trap. Every interaction carried the threat of punishment. To survive, patients learned to be silent, submissive, invisible. The terrifying irony is that the very people entrusted with care became the ward's predators. They enforced its rules, carried out its punishments, and created an atmosphere where fear was constant. In their hands, treatment became indistinguishable from torment. And yet, because they wore the mantle of authority, their actions were excused, even praised. Reports to the public spoke of discipline and order, never mentioning the bruises, the broken bones, or the broken minds left in their wake. In the end, the staff of the ward were both products and enforcers of the system. They were shaped by the corruption, neglect, and flawed science of their time, and in turn, they shaped the ward into a place of terror. To the outside world, they were doctors and nurses. To the inmates, they were hunters, jailers, and monsters. Their power was absolute, their cruelty unchecked. And in their hands, the patients became prey. Amidst the silence and terror of the ward, there were a few who dared to break the unwritten law of submission. These were the patients who resisted, who spoke out against their treatment, who attempted to expose the horrors that thrived behind locked doors. Their voices were frail compared to the power of the institution, yet their words, when they slipped beyond the asylum walls, carried an echo that could not be entirely silenced. Most patients quickly learned the cost of rebellion. To speak against a doctor, nurse, or orderly meant punishment, isolation in a freezing cell, confinement in a straitjacket, or worse, the infamous tranquilizing chair, where one could be strapped for hours until limbs went numb and the body collapsed into exhaustion. The threat of these punishments kept many quiet. But there were those who refused to bow, whose desperation or sheer courage compelled them to try. Some left behind fragments of testimony, scraps of writing smuggled out with visitors, whispered confessions to sympathetic ears, or rare published accounts. In one instance, a patient described the ward as a place where humanity is strangled, and suffering is bred like vermin. Another recalled nights filled with screams, cut short only when orderlies descended. These words painted a picture far removed from the polished reports presented to the public, revealing instead a daily struggle for survival. Among the most haunting stories were those of women. In the asylum system, women were often admitted for reasons that today seem absurd: postpartum depression, hysteria, even simply being difficult wives. Once inside, their complaints were dismissed as madness, yet some tried to resist. They wrote secret letters, hidden in hems of clothing or smuggled out by trusted visitors. A few reached sympathetic journalists who printed their words anonymously. These women described nurses who pinched and mocked them, orderlies who threatened them in the dark, doctors who performed experiments without explanation. Their testimonies spoke of a different kind of horror, one rooted in exploitation and powerlessness. One particularly tragic case involved a young immigrant man who had been institutionalized after an injury left him prone to seizures. His English was broken, but he managed to tell a visiting clergyman that the orderlies beat him regularly. The clergyman reported this, but the administration dismissed it, claiming the man was hallucinating. Weeks later, he was found dead after what was recorded as a seizure, though other patients whispered of bruises covering his body. His attempt to speak out had been swallowed by the system, his voice erased. Not all attempts at resistance were verbal. Some patients carved words or symbols into the wooden walls of their cells. Visitors later reported seeing strange etchings, words like help, names, dates, even crude drawings of the punishments endured. These markings were acts of rebellion, desperate efforts to leave proof that they had lived, suffered, and tried to tell the truth. In many cases, these carvings outlasted their makers, silent witnesses that the ward's history could not fully erase. Occasionally, a patient managed to reach beyond the asylum walls with more force. There were scattered reports of escapees who ran directly to newspapers, clutching stories of abuse and neglect. Some were dismissed as lunatics, their words treated as the ravings of unstable minds. But others struck a chord, especially when their accounts aligned with whispers already circulating about corruption within the asylum system. These testimonies planted seeds of doubt in the public mind, suggesting that the institutions meant to protect society might, in fact, be devouring the vulnerable. One of the greatest obstacles these patients faced was credibility. In the 19th century, to be labeled insane was to be stripped of one's voice. Any protest, no matter how rational, could be dismissed as a symptom of delusion. A bruised face could be explained away as self-inflicted, a fearful testimony as paranoia. The staff and administration held the authority to define reality, and patients' words were easily drowned in official denials. This imbalance turned truth-telling into an act of near-impossible defiance. Yet, their voices, though scattered, mattered. They became part of the fragile record, the counter-narrative to the institution's polished reports. Later reformers and journalists would piece together these fragments, realizing that behind each whispered testimony was a pattern of systemic abuse. The courage of those who spoke out, even if their voices were silenced in their time, provided the foundation for later generations to uncover the truth. The tragedy is that most who spoke out paid dearly. Some were beaten into submission, others drugged or restrained until their defiance faded. Many simply disappeared into the endless routine of the ward, their moment of rebellion forgotten by all but themselves. For them, resistance was both a victory and a curse, a declaration of humanity in a place designed to strip it away, but one that carried unbearable consequences. The image of these patients is haunting. Picture a man scribbling a desperate note by candlelight, knowing it might never leave his room. Imagine a woman whispering her story to a visitor, terrified that a nurse might overhear. Envision carvings on wooden walls, etched with shaking hands, declaring to anyone who might someday see, "We were here. This was real." These acts of courage remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, there were voices fighting to be heard. In the shadow of the ward, these voices were fragile, flickering like candles against a storm. Most were extinguished quickly, but some endured, passed from memory to memory, document to document, until they reached us today. And in their endurance, they expose a chilling truth, that silence was not the natural state of the asylum, but an enforced one. Where silence reigned, it was because those who dared to speak had been crushed. The ward hunted its patients in many ways, through neglect, through violence, through despair. But perhaps its most insidious hunt was for their voices, stripping them of credibility, erasing their testimony, ensuring that their suffering would remain unseen. Yet, despite the system's power, a few voices broke through. And those voices, trembling though they were, ensure that the horrors of the ward were never completely forgotten. When daylight faded and the heavy iron doors were bolted shut, the ward transformed into something darker. At night, the institution was stripped of its thin veil of civility. The corridors echoed differently, less with the clutter of daily routine, more with whispers, moans, and sudden, jarring sounds. For patients, nighttime was the most terrifying stretch of the day. It was when the rules loosened, when the staff's watchful eyes grew sharper, and when things often happened that were never recorded in any logbook. The night watch consisted of a smaller crew, a few nurses, orderlies, and attendants who rotated shifts to maintain order until dawn. In theory, their job was simple: keep patients safe, stop fights, monitor emergencies. But in reality, the night belonged to them. With fewer supervisors and no visitors, there was no one to hold them accountable. Many saw the long, dark hours as opportunities to exercise unchecked control. Patients later recalled how the atmosphere shifted after sundown. Orderlies walked slower, dragging their boots against the stone floors, their keys rattling against their belts like chains. They carried lanterns that cast narrow beams of light, leaving most of the hallways cloaked in shadows. 4 inmates huddled in their beds. The sound of those boots growing closer often meant dread. It wasn't just about being checked on, it was about being chosen. The stories of vanishings emerged from this darkness. Patients whispered of those who had gone to bed in their straw mats one evening and were simply not there the next morning. Officially, these absences were explained away: a sudden death from illness, a transfer to another building, even claims of suicide. But the details never quite added up. Some of the missing were young and physically strong, unlikely to collapse overnight. Others had shown no signs of the supposed mad fits that were blamed for their disappearance. For those left behind, the mystery deepened the sense of terror. Rumors spread of patients taken from their rooms in the dead of night, dragged into basements or hidden chambers where orderlies carried out punishments too severe to be witnessed in daylight. Some spoke of bodies carried through back corridors and loaded onto wagons before dawn, carted away to medical schools or buried without ceremony. There were tales of experiments, patients vanishing only to return days later, broken and unrecognizable, or sometimes never returning at all. These vanishings were never officially documented, yet they became part of the oral history among the patients. They whispered warnings: don't resist too loudly, don't meet the wrong orderly's eyes, don't speak out after dark. Night became a game of survival, where silence and invisibility were the only protections. Nurses played their own part in this shadowy drama. Some patrolled the halls quietly, turning blind eyes to what happened in the darker corners. Others became active participants, assisting in the removals, recording false notes in the ledgers to cover gaps. In a system already soaked in corruption, the night watch was the perfect environment for cruelty to thrive. For the few outsiders who visited after hours, inspectors or clergy, there was often a staged calm. The patients were locked away, the halls freshly cleaned, the orderlies standing at attention. But this facade lasted only as long as the visitors' presence. Once the doors closed behind them, the mask was dropped. Accounts that survive hint at just how pervasive the fear of the night was. One escaped patient, interviewed years later, recalled lying awake each evening, feigning sleep, listening to the footsteps outside his cell. You never knew, he said, if they would stop at your door. You never knew if it was your turn to vanish. His testimony reflects the gnawing uncertainty that plagued everyone inside, that no one was safe, not even in the dead of night. The disappearances served a dual purpose. They rid the staff of problem patients, those who resisted, spoke out, or became too much trouble. But they also reinforced control. Each absence was a warning, a grim lesson to those who remained. If you disobey, you too can be made to vanish. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. Fear kept patients compliant more effectively than any straitjacket. In time, rumors of these vanishings leaked beyond the ward. Families who asked too many questions about their missing relatives were given vague or contradictory answers. Some suspected foul play but lacked the power to challenge the institution. With Tammany Hall's grip on city politics, complaints were buried, records altered, and the whispers of the powerless ignored. What remains chilling is how complete the night silence was. Official records are scarce, leaving only fragments of testimony from survivors. But the consistency of the stories, echoing across decades, across different wards, across different asylums, suggests that what happened in New York was part of a larger pattern. The night was not a time of rest, but of terror, when the hunters walked freely and the patients, like prey, waited helplessly in their cages. The vanishings remind us that in places of unchecked authority, disappearance itself becomes a weapon. To erase a person, to strip them not only of freedom but of existence, is the ultimate exercise of power. And in the ward that hunted its patients, the night provided the perfect cover for such erasures. If the daytime routines of the ward were bleak, the so-called treatments carried out within its walls revealed an even darker truth. In theory, the institution existed to cure, to rehabilitate, to restore broken minds. But in practice, it often became a laboratory where patients were stripped not only of freedom but of dignity and humanity, subjected to procedures that blurred the line between medicine and torture. The 19th century was a time of deep medical uncertainty. Mental illness was still poorly understood, caught between superstition and emerging science. Physicians believed madness stemmed from imbalances of the body: too much blood, overstimulated nerves, faulty organs. Treatments were devised not from compassion, but from theories untested and unverified, theories that allowed the body to be probed, drained, shocked, and restrained in pursuit of cures. The patients of the ward became unwilling participants in these grim experiments. One of the most common procedures was bloodletting. Though its popularity had waned elsewhere in medicine, asylum doctors clung to it with zeal. Patients considered agitated, violent, or overheated were strapped down while veins were opened, often repeatedly. Buckets of blood were drained in the belief that madness could be released with it. Those who survived were left weak, pale, and trembling, their suffering dismissed as proof the treatment was working. Another favorite was the cold water cure. Patients were forced into ice baths for hours at a time, their bodies convulsing as attendants held them down. Some were left to shiver in drenched clothing, the icy fabric clinging to their skin until numbness set in. Doctors claimed the shock calmed disordered minds, that cold forced the body back into equilibrium. But survivors recalled teeth chattering, lungs aching, and the deep terror of drowning when attendants plunged their heads beneath the water without warning. Restraints, too, were labeled as treatment. The straitjacket became an everyday tool, not only to subdue violent patients but to silence anyone who resisted. Some were left bound for hours or even days, muscles cramping, circulation failing. The so-called tranquilizing chair was even worse, a massive wooden structure where patients were strapped by arms, legs, chest, and head, immobilized for endless hours. A hood or mask was sometimes placed over the face to block sound and sight, turning the experience into an exercise in sensory deprivation. Doctors described this as soothing. Patients described it as suffocating madness. Emerging technologies added a new layer of cruelty. Electricity, still a mysterious force in the 19th century, fascinated asylum doctors. Patients were subjected to currents applied to their temples, spines, or even genitals. Some were forced to bite down on metal rods while jolts coursed through their bodies. The doctors recorded observations of convulsions, drooling, and muscle spasms as though they were scientific data, ignoring the agony that produced them. For the patients, these sessions were nightmares of fire running through their veins, nightmares they could never escape. Surgical experiments also crept into the ward. Some physicians believed madness originated in the digestive system and experimented with extreme purgatives, inducing vomiting and diarrhea to cleanse the body. Others attempted crude procedures on the skull, scraping or drilling in hopes of relieving pressure on the brain. Few survived such operations. Those who did were often left permanently disabled. To the doctors, these failures were not tragedies but valuable notes for their research. The cruelest irony was that these treatments were often documented in calm, clinical language. Reports spoke of successful application or patient did not survive procedure, with the same detachment one might use to describe a failed experiment on an animal. The human suffering beneath those words was erased, reduced to data points in a ledger. Compounding the horror was the lack of consent. Patients had no choice, no ability to refuse. Their protests were taken as symptoms of madness, their resistance as proof they needed more treatment. Once confined, their bodies belonged to the institution. And with Tammany Hall politics shielding the asylum from scrutiny, there was no external force to question what was being done inside. Some patients did attempt to fight back. Accounts survive of men ripping free of straps, women screaming until their voices cracked, inmates refusing food after repeated shocks or baths. Yet these acts of resistance were met with further punishment, solitary confinement, tighter restraints, or escalated treatments. The system was designed to crush defiance. For the staff, these procedures also served another purpose: control. A patient subjected to repeated bloodletting or freezing baths grew too weak to resist. One locked in the tranquilizing chair for days became docile from exhaustion. In this way, treatment blurred seamlessly into discipline. What was presented as medical science functioned as punishment, a way to break the will of those who might otherwise rebel. To modern eyes, it is tempting to see these practices as relics of ignorance. But in their time, they carried an aura of authority. Doctors spoke in terms of humors, nerves, and imbalances. Nurses repeated the language of cure and recovery. The public, largely uninformed, accepted these assurances. Families who entrusted loved ones to the ward believed treatment was being given. They could not imagine the reality, that their relatives were being hunted through procedures that left scars, broken bodies, and unmarked graves. The most chilling legacy of these experiments is not only the physical suffering they inflicted but the philosophy they revealed. Patients were not seen as individuals with rights, dignity, or humanity. They were objects, problems to be solved, bodies to be tested, cases to be recorded. Madness stripped them of personhood in the eyes of the institution, and once that personhood was gone, anything could be justified. In the end, the treatments of the ward served less to heal than to reinforce the hierarchy of power. Doctors claimed knowledge, nurses enforced obedience, and patients became test subjects in a grim theater of cruelty. Each procedure was framed as progress, but beneath the surface it was little more than sanctioned torment. The ward had promised care. Instead, it delivered suffering disguised as science. And as the night watch claimed its victims in silence, the experiments ensured that even those who survived carried their torment within their bodies. Broken bones healed crooked, scar tissue lingered, minds fractured further from trauma. The ward hunted its patients not only through neglect and abuse but through the very treatments that were supposed to save them. In a place already steeped in misery, death was never far away. It lingered in the air, in the damp corridors, in the hollow stairs of those too weak to rise from their mats. The asylum was supposed to be a place of healing, but its walls became more of a mausoleum, one where life faded quietly, sometimes violently, and almost always without dignity. Mortality in the ward was disturbingly common. Overcrowding meant disease spread like wildfire. Tuberculosis, cholera, influenza, any illness that passed through the city found fertile ground in the asylum's cramped quarters. Patients slept in close rows, breathing the same stale, infected air, sharing unwashed blankets that carried lice and fleas. Malnutrition made their bodies fragile, unable to fight even the smallest infection. A cough in the night could echo down the corridor like an omen. But disease was not the only killer. The treatments themselves often claimed lives. A patient weakened by repeated bloodletting could collapse and never rise again. Another left too long in an icy bath might succumb to pneumonia. A botched surgical experiment could mean bleeding out on the table, the doctor writing a cold note in his ledger as if the death were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. To the institution, these fatalities were not tragedies but inevitabilities, written off as the cost of science or the nature of madness. Then there were the darker deaths, the ones whispered about by survivors. Patients beaten too harshly by orderlies, their bodies bruised and broken. Women who never returned from late-night sessions with staff, their absence explained away with vague reports of transfer. Suicides that raised more questions than answers. A patient said to have hanged himself with scraps of cloth, though he had been stripped of everything only hours before. In such cases, the line between suicide and murder blurred until it all became part of the same silence. Death was not treated with respect. When a patient died, the body was often left where it fell until attendants could be spared to remove it. Fellow inmates might spend hours, even days, lying beside the corpse of a roommate, too terrified to call for help or too accustomed to death's presence to bother. When the body was finally removed, it was carried unceremoniously down hidden corridors to a basement morgue. There, the dead were stored like objects, often without names, only numbers scribbled on tags that could easily be lost. Families sometimes received word of a death weeks later, if at all. Letters were vague, offering no details beyond the fact of passing. Some were told their loved ones had died of natural causes, a phrase so broad it covered every possibility. Others were told nothing at all, left to wonder why letters had stopped, why visits were suddenly denied. In a city as vast and chaotic as New York, the loss of one poor soul within the asylum system was easily overlooked. Many of the bodies never reached their families. Instead, they were sold quietly to medical schools, their remains dissected by students eager for hands-on training. It was a grim economy, one that turned death into profit. Those not sold were buried in mass graves, anonymous pits dug in the potter's fields. There were no headstones, no prayers, no ceremonies. Just soil shoveled over nameless bodies, stacked one upon another until the ground itself became heavy with forgotten lives. For the patients who remained, death was both a terror and, for some, a release. To die in the ward meant vanishing into silence, erased from history. Yet for those who suffered endlessly under abuse and cruelty, death could also appear as the only escape. Whispers passed through the halls. Some envied the dead, imagining them free from the endless torment. Others clung to life with desperate ferocity, fearing that death within those walls meant being consumed by the institution forever, body and soul. The presence of death seeped into the daily rhythm of the asylum. Each loss was a reminder to the living of their fragility, their helplessness. It reinforced the ward's power, showing that even the final boundary of existence was controlled by the institution. Patients did not die as individuals. They became part of the asylum's machinery, statistics to be filed, bodies to be disposed of. What makes these deaths most haunting is the silence surrounding them. Official reports reduce them to numbers, stripping away the human stories. The city at large rarely asked questions, too busy with its own struggles to care about the forgotten wards of the asylum. Only fragments, diaries, whispered accounts, rumors passed to outsiders, hint at the true scale of suffering. To imagine death in that place is to picture not just the physical end of life but the erasure of identity. A man admitted with a name, a history, a family became, in death, nothing more than an unclaimed body in a cold basement. A woman who once had dreams and memories became a faceless figure in a mass grave. Their stories ended not with remembrance but with oblivion. And yet, these deaths are not completely lost. They linger in the unease we feel when we look at the ruins of such asylums, in the chill that creeps through old photographs, in the names that occasionally resurface in yellowed reports. The ward may have tried to bury its victims in silence, but silence has a way of betraying itself. The sheer number of the dead becomes impossible to ignore, a weight pressing down through history. In the ward that hunted its patients, death was not a stranger, it was a resident. It walked the halls with the staff, sat in the corners of treatment rooms, and slept beside the living in overcrowded dormitories. It was patient, inevitable, and merciless. And for those who perished within those walls, death was not just the end of life but the final act of erasure, the last cruelty of an institution built not to heal but to consume. For years, the asylum's horrors remained hidden behind its iron gates and thick stone walls. The city knew little of what happened inside, and those who did often chose silence. Families, ashamed to admit they had institutionalized loved ones, rarely pressed for details. Officials, invested in keeping the system running cheaply, turned away from complaints. But in time, the truth began to leak out, first as whispers, then as a flood of scandal that shook the public's trust. The first cracks appeared through rumors carried by discharged patients. Some returned to society broken but coherent enough to speak of what they endured. Their stories were met with skepticism. To many, the word of the insane was worthless, dismissed as delusion or exaggeration. Yet patterns emerged. Too many tales of abuse, starvation, and death to be ignored. The whispers became impossible to silence. Then came the reformers. Driven by a belief in justice, or, for some, by a desire for notoriety, they sought access to the wards. Among them were clergymen, charity workers, and a few daring journalists. They petitioned for inspections, sometimes bribing guards to gain entry. When they left, they carried with them accounts of filth, neglect, and cruelty so severe that even hardened officials could not dismiss them outright. One of the most famous exposures came from the work of journalists willing to go undercover. Most notorious of all was the young reporter Nellie Bly, who in 1887 feigned insanity to gain admission to Blackwell's Island Asylum. Though her story came years after the earliest scandals, it crystallized what reformers had whispered for decades. Her published account described patients forced to eat rancid food, bathe in freezing water, and endure constant abuse. She wrote of women who had been sane before entering, broken down into shells of themselves within weeks. Her words electrified the public, giving voice to suffering long ignored. Before Bly, however, smaller scandals had already begun to erupt. In the mid-19th century, official inspections sometimes revealed disturbing details. Patients chained in damp cells, attendants drunk on duty, wards overcrowded beyond all measure. Reports surfaced of women locked away for little more than disobedience, men beaten for questioning staff, children confined alongside dangerous adults. Each revelation chipped away at the illusion that the asylum was a sanctuary of care. The newspapers seized on these stories. In an age when sensational headlines sold copies, tales of madness and cruelty were irresistible. Writers described the wards as dungeons, their patients as victims of a system more monstrous than the diseases it claimed to treat. The public, fascinated and horrified, devoured every word. Scandal became entertainment, but it also stirred outrage. Families of patients began to demand answers. Some sued the institutions, though few won their cases. Others turned to reform societies, joining groups that campaigned for oversight and regulation. These movements were often led by women, who saw in the asylum system a reflection of broader social injustices, the silencing of the poor, the powerless, and especially women themselves. For them, exposing the asylum was not just about saving patients but about challenging a society that used confinement as control. The scandals reached a boiling point when corruption was uncovered among the administrators. Investigations revealed that funds intended for food and medicine were siphoned off, lining the pockets of officials while patients starved. Contracts for supplies were handed to political allies, who delivered spoiled meat and watered-down milk. The asylum was not just a site of cruelty, it was a machine of exploitation, profiting from suffering. Each exposure forced city officials to respond. Promises of reform were made: new oversight committees, stricter rules, better funding. Some institutions saw brief improvements: cleaner wards, better rations, a reduction in restraints. But the cycle of scandal and reform repeated endlessly. With time, abuses returned, hidden once more until the next journalist or reformer dragged them into the light. The most striking element of these scandals was how often the victims were disbelieved until someone from outside confirmed their accounts. A patient could scream of abuse, starve before witnesses, or bear visible bruises, yet their voice alone was powerless. Only when an outsider corroborated their suffering did the public care. This revealed the deeper cruelty of the system. It robbed people not just of their freedom but of their credibility, erasing their ability to be heard even when speaking truth. For the public, the revelations provoked a mix of outrage and fear. Outrage at the suffering inflicted on society's most vulnerable, but also fear of the institutions themselves. If the asylum could do this to the mad, could it not do the same to anyone? After all, many of the admitted had not been insane at all, merely inconvenient, poor, or socially defiant. The scandals exposed not just a medical failure but a social weapon, one that could be turned against anyone who fell outside society's rigid norms. Over time, the exposure of asylum abuses contributed to larger debates about mental health, poverty, and human rights. Calls for moral treatment and humane care gained traction. Activists pushed for community support, better training for staff, and alternatives to mass confinement. Some of these reforms bore fruit, leading to the eventual decline of the giant asylum model in the 20th century. Yet the scandals also left scars, reminders of how easily institutions built for care could become engines of cruelty. In retrospect, the exposure and scandals surrounding the asylums reveal a grim pattern. Without constant scrutiny, the suffering of the voiceless is always at risk of being buried. The press, reformers, and public outrage forced moments of change, but each victory was fragile. The patients, meanwhile, continued to live and die within walls that seemed immune to permanent reform. The legacy of these exposures lingers today in the caution with which we view psychiatric institutions. They remind us that systems of power, especially those that confine and control, are fertile ground for abuse. They warn that silence is complicity, and that only relentless exposure can keep the truth alive. In the end, the scandals did not only reveal what happened behind the walls, they revealed something about society itself, its willingness to look away until forced to confront the suffering of those it had chosen to forget. And once the truth came out, it could never again be completely hidden. The story of New York's forgotten asylum ward is not confined to the dusty annals of history. Its legacy seeps into the present, shaping how we think about mental health, institutions, and the human cost of neglect. The ward that once hunted its patients has long since been abandoned, its walls crumbling, its name erased from official memory. Yet the echoes of its cruelty remain. They linger not just in the rare photographs and scattered documents, but in the very foundations of how society remembers, and misremembers, the people it locked away. One of the clearest legacies lies in the evolution of psychiatric care. The scandals and exposures that shook the asylum system in the late 19th and early 20th centuries forced medicine to reckon with its failures. Reformers argued that massive institutions, designed to hold hundreds or even thousands of patients, were inherently inhumane. They called for smaller facilities, for moral treatment, and for alternatives to confinement. These movements slowly transformed psychiatry, leading to more emphasis on therapy, structured daily life, and eventually, in the mid-20th century, to the rise of psychiatric medication. The horrors of the ward became cautionary tales, teaching doctors what not to do. But even as psychiatry changed, the darker legacy persisted. The stigma surrounding mental illness was reinforced by decades of mistreatment. Families who had committed relatives to asylums often never spoke of them again, erasing their existence from family histories. Generations grew up with whispers of a mad aunt or a troubled uncle who disappeared behind institutional walls, their fate never fully explained. The silence bred shame, and the shame hardened into cultural attitudes that still make discussions of mental illness fraught today. The asylum's abuses did not just destroy lives in the moment, they created ripples of silence and stigma that lasted long after the gates closed. There is also the architectural legacy. Across New York and the wider United States, the shells of asylum buildings still stand. Some have been converted into luxury apartments, museums, or office parks. Others lie in ruin, ivy crawling up their stone walls, windows smashed and roofs collapsing. Urban explorers wander these spaces, documenting their decay, capturing the eerie contrast of beauty and horror in photographs shared online. To some, they are merely relics of a bygone era. To others, they are haunted sites, heavy with the memory of those who suffered within. The walls may no longer confine the living, but they hold a presence that refuses to fade. Culturally, the asylum has left an indelible mark on our imagination. From literature to film, the trope of the haunted asylum remains one of the most powerful images in Gothic storytelling. Ghost stories set in abandoned wards echo the real-life suffering that once occurred, blending fact with legend. Horror films depict doctors as sadists, nurses as tormentors, and patients as both victims and monsters. These stories exaggerate, but they draw their power from a truth: the knowledge that institutions meant to heal became places of cruelty. The asylum ward is both real history and enduring metaphor, an emblem of what happens when society abandons empathy. The legacy is also political. The exposure of asylum scandals in the 19th century helped lay the groundwork for later movements advocating human rights for the mentally ill. In the mid-20th century, as deinstitutionalization swept through the United States, reformers often cited the old abuses as justification for closing the massive state hospitals. The memory of chained patients and overcrowded wards became a rallying cry for community-based care. Yet here, too, the legacy is complicated. Many of the institutions were closed without adequate alternatives, leaving vulnerable people to fend for themselves. The cycle of abandonment continued, this time on the streets instead of within stone walls. In this way, the ghosts of the wards still haunt modern cities, visible in the homeless populations and the struggles of the undertreated mentally ill. There is a psychological legacy as well. For those who study the history of medicine, the ward stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. Doctors, nurses, and attendants, many of whom may have believed themselves to be acting in the name of care, inflicted horrors under the guise of treatment. The lesson is clear: when patients are stripped of agency, when institutions are shielded from oversight, and when suffering is hidden from public view, abuse becomes inevitable. This warning extends beyond psychiatry. Prisons, orphanages, nursing homes, all institutions that confine and control the vulnerable, carry the same risk. The asylum is not just a story of mental illness, it is a story of power and how easily it corrupts. For descendants of those once confined, the legacy is more intimate. In recent decades, as genealogical research has flourished, families have rediscovered ancestors who vanished into asylums. Old records reveal names, dates, and diagnoses long buried. For some, this is a source of pain, a reminder of shame and secrecy. For others, it is an opportunity for healing, to acknowledge the suffering of those forgotten and to restore them to family memory. The asylum's legacy is thus not only social and medical but deeply personal, woven into the fabric of countless family histories. Perhaps the most chilling legacy, however, is the knowledge of how thin the line once was between freedom and confinement. In 1871 New York, a person could be declared insane for reasons that today would seem absurd: grief, rebelliousness, alcoholism, even mere poverty. The ward was a weapon of social control, a place where inconvenient people could be hidden away. Remembering this forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do we, in our own time, silence or disappear those we do not wish to deal with? Do we exile them into prisons, into homelessness, into underfunded hospitals? The asylum teaches us that cruelty is often not a relic of the past, but a pattern repeated in new forms. In the end, the legacy of the ward is one of paradox. It is a story of horror, but also of reform. It is a story of silenced voices, but also of whistleblowers and reformers who refuse to look away. It is a story of forgotten lives, but also of memory, clawing its way back into the present through research, storytelling, and remembrance. The ward that hunted its patients may no longer stand, but its shadows stretch long. They remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about what we choose to remember. And in remembering, we give voice to those who were silenced. We keep alive the warning that institutions, left unchecked, will always drift toward cruelty. And we confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between care and horror is far thinner than we like to believe.